Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin, you cultured bumpkins. This is, I don't know what session it is, seven, six, something like that. But we're picking up with Sense and Sensibility, Chapter 40. I didn't even check before we came on. I'm 99% sure 39 was the last chapter we read. Excuse me. Uh, Someone can correct me on that if I am wrong, but I think 39 was the last one, so we'll pick up with 40. I can always come back and redo one if I need to. That happened in Pride and Prejudice, actually. So let's do this. Let's do this. Um, Actually, let me good. I gotta make a little change here. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Here we go. Chapter 40. Well, Miss Dashwood, said Mrs. Jennings, sagaciously smiling as soon as the gentleman had withdrawn, I don't ask you what the colonel's been trying to say to you, for though upon my honor I tried to keep out of hearing, I could not help catching enough to understand his business. And I assure you I was never better pleased in my life, and I wish you joy of it with all my heart. Thank you, ma'am, said Eleanor. It's a matter of great joy to me, and I feel the goodness of Colonel Brandon most sensibly. There are not many men who would act as he had done. There are not many men who would act as he has done. Few people who have so compassionate a heart. I was never more astonished in my life. Lord, my dear, you're very modest. I ain't the least astonished at it in the world, for I have often thought of late there was nothing more likely to happen. You judged from your knowledge of the colonel's general benevolence, at least you could not foresee that. But at least you could not foresee that the opportunity would so very soon occur. Opportunity, repeated Mrs. Jennings. Oh, as to that, when a man has once made up his mind to such a thing, somehow or other he will soon find an opportunity. Well, my dear, I wish you joy of it again and again, and if ever there was a happy couple in the world, I think I shall soon know where to look for 'em. You mean to go to Delaford after them? You mean to go to Delaford after them, I suppose? Said Eleanor with a faint smile. Ay, my dear, that I do indeed. And as to the house being a bad one, I don't know what the colonel would be at, for it's as good a one as I ever saw. He spoke of its being out of repair. Well, and whose fault is that? Why don't he repair it? Who should do it but himself? They were interrupted by the they were interrupted by the servants coming in to announce the marriage being They were interrupted by the servants coming in to announce the carriage being at the door, and Mrs. Jennings, immediately preparing to go, said, Well, my dear, I must be gone before I've had half my talk, but however, we may have it all over in the evening, for we shall be quite alone. For we shall be quite alone. I do not ask you to go with me, for I dare say your mind's too full of the matter to care for company, and besides, you must long to tell your sister all about it. Marianne had left the room before the conversation began. Certainly, ma'am, I shall tell Marianne of it, but I shall not mention it at present to anybody else. Oh, very well, said Mrs. Jennings, rather disappointed. Then you would rather me not then you would not have me tell it to Lucy, I think of it going I think of going as far as Holborn today. No, ma'am, not even Lucy, if you please. One day's delay will not be very material. Until I've written to Mrs. Ferris, I think it ought not to be mentioned to anybody else. I shall do that directly. It is of importance that no time should be lost with him, for he, of course, will have much to do relative to his ordination. This speech at first puzzled Mrs. Jennings exceedingly. Why Mr. Ferris was to have been written to about it in such a hurry she could not immediately comprehend. A few moments' reflection, however, produced a very happy idea, and she exclaimed, Oh, I understand. Mr. Ferris is to be the man. Well, so much better for him. I am to be sure he must be ordained in readiness, and I'm very glad to find things are so forward between you. But, my dear, is this not rather out of character? Should not the colonel write himself? Sure, he's the proper person. Eleanor didn't Eleanor did not quite understand the beginning of Mrs. Jennings's speech, neither did she think it worth inquiring into, and therefore only replied to its conclusion. Colonel Brandon is so delicate a man that he rather wished anyone to announce his inten- that he rather wished anyone to announce his intentions to Mr. Ferris than himself. And so you're forced to do it. Well, that's kind of an odd delicacy. However, I will not disturb you, seeing you're preparing to write. You know your own concerns best. So goodbye, my dear. I have not heard of anything to please me so well since Charlotte was brought to bed. And away she went, but returning again in a moment. I've just been thinking of Betty's sister, my dear. I should be very glad to get her so good a mistress. But whether she would do for a lady's maid, I'm sure I can't tell. She's an honest housemaid and works very well at her needle. However, you will think of it all. You will think of all that at your leisure. Certainly, ma'am, replied Eleanor, not hearing much of what was said, and more anxious to be alone than to be mistress of the subject. How she should begin, how should she express herself in her note to Edward was now all her concern. The particular circumstances between them made a difficulty of that which to any other person would have been the easiest thing in the world. But she equally feared to say too much or too little, and sat deliberating over her paper with the pen in her hand till broken in excuse me, till broken in on the till broken in on by the entrance of Edward himself. He had met Mrs. Jennings at the door in her way to the carriage as he came to leave his farewell card, and she, after apologizing for not returning herself, had obliged him to enter by saying that Miss Dashwood was above and wanted to speak with him on very particular business. Eleanor had just been congratulating herself, in the midst of her perplexity, that however difficult it might be to express herself properly by letter, it was at least preferable to giving the information by word of mouth, when her visitor entered, to force her upon this greatest exertion of all. Her astonishment and confusion were very great on his so sudden appearance. She had not seen him before since his engagement became public, and therefore not since his knowing her to be acquainted with it, which, with the consciousness of what she had been thinking of and what she had to tell him, made her feel particularly uncomfortable for some minutes. He, too, was much distressed, and they sat down together in a most promising state of embarrassment. Whether he had asked her pardon for his intrusion on her first coming into the room, he could not recollect. But determining to be on the safe side, he made his apology in form as soon as he could say anything after taking a chair. Mrs. Jennings told me, said he, that you wished to speak with me. At least I understood her so, or I certainly should not have intruded on you in such a manner, though at the same time I should have been extremely sorry to leave London without seeing you and your sister, especially as it will most likely be some time. It's not probable that I should have the pleasure of meeting you again. I go to Oxford tomorrow. You would not have gone, however, said Eleanor, recovering herself and determined to get over what she so dreaded as soon as possible, without receiving our good wishes, even if we had not been able to give them in person. Mrs. Jennings was quite right in what she said. I have something of consequence to inform you of, which I was on the point of communicating by paper. I am charged with a most agreeable office, breathing rather faster than usual as she spoke. Colonel Brandon, who was here only 10 minutes ago, has desired me to say that, understanding you mean to take orders, he has great pleasure in offering you the living of Delaford, now just vacant, and only wishes it were more valuable. Allow me to congratulate you on having so respectable and well-judging a friend, and to join in his wish that the living, it is about 200 a year, were much more considerable, and such as might better enable you, as might be more than a temporary accommodation to yourself, such, in short, as might establish all your views of happiness. What Edward felt, he could not say it himself. As he could not say it himself, it cannot be expected that anyone else should say it for him. He looked all the astonishment which such unexpected, such unthought of information could not fail of excite. Excuse me. Such unthought of information could not fail of exciting, but he said only these two words, "Colonel Brandon?" "Yes," continued Eleanor, gathering more resolution as some of the worst was over. Colonel Brandon means it as a testimony of his concern of what has lately passed, for the cruel situation in which the unjustifiable conduct of your family has placed you. A, a concern which I am sure Marianne, myself, and all your friends must share, and likewise as a proof of his high esteem for your general character and his particular approbation of your behavior on the present occasion. Colonel Brandon give me a living? Can it be possible? The unkindness of your own relations has made you astonished to find friendship anywhere. No, replied he with sudden consciousness, not to find it in you, for I cannot be excuse me, for I cannot be ignorant that to you, to your goodness, I owe it all. I feel it. I would express it if I could, but as you well know, I am no orator. You're very much mistaken. You're very much mistaken. I do assure you that you owe it entirely, at least almost entirely, to your own merit and Colonel Brandon's discernment of it. I've had no hand in it. I did not even know till I did not even know till I understood his till I understood his till I understood his design that the living was vacant. Nor had it ever occurred to me that he might have had such a living in his gift. As a friend of mine, of my family, he may perhaps, indeed I know he has, still greater pleasure in bestowing it. But upon my word, you owe nothing to my solicitation. Truth obliged her to acknowledge some small share in the action, but she was at the same time so unwilling to appear as the benefactress of Edward that she acknowledged it with hesitation, which probably contributed to fix that suspicion in his mind which had recently entered it. For a short time he sat deep in thought after Eleanor had ceased to speak. At last, as if it were rather an effort, he said, Colonel Brandon seems a man of great worth and respectability. I've always heard him spoken of as such, and your brother, I know, esteems him highly. He's undoubtedly a sensible man, and in his manners perfectly the gentleman. Indeed, replied Eleanor, I believe that you'll find him, on further acquaintance, all that you've heard him to be. And as you'll be very near neighbors, for I understand the parsonage is almost close to the mansion house, it's particularly important that he should be at all this. It is particularly important that he should be all this. Edward made no answer, but when she had turned away her head, gave her a look so serious, so earnest, so uncheerful, as seemed to say that he might hereafter wish the distance between the parsonage and the mansion house much greater. Colonel Brandon, I think, lodges in St. James Street, he said soon afterwards, rising from his chair. Eleanor told him the number of the house. I must hurry away, then, to give him those thanks which you'll not allow me to give you, to assure him that he's made me an exceedingly happy man. Eleanor did not offer to excuse me. Eleanor did not offer to detain him, and after they parted, with a very earnest assurance on her side of her unceasing good wishes for his happiness in every change of situation that might befall him, on his with rather an attempt to return the same goodwill than the power of expressing it. Eleanor did not offer to detain him, and they parted with a very earnest assurance on her side of her unceasing good wishes for his happiness in every change of situation that might befall him, on his with rather an attempt to return the same goodwill than the power of receiving it. When I see him again, said Eleanor to herself as the door shut him out, I shall see him the husband of Lucy. And with this pleasing anticipation, she sat down to reconsider the past, recall the words, and endeavor to comprehend all the feelings of Edward, and of course to reflect on her own with discontent. When Mrs. Jennings came home, though she returned from seeing people whom she had never seen before, and of whom therefore she must have had a great deal to say, her mind was so much more occupied by the important secret in her possession than by anything else, that she reverted to it again as soon as Eleanor appeared. Well, my dear, she cried, I sent you up the young I sent up to you the young man. Did not I do right? And I suppose you had no great difficulty. You did not find him very unwilling to accept your proposal. No, ma'am, that was not very likely. Well, and how soon will he be ready? For it seems all to depend on that. Really, said Eleanor, I know so little of those kind of forms that I can hardly even conjecture as to the time or the preparation necessary. But I suppose 2 or 3 months will complete his ordination. 2 or 3 months! Cried Mrs. Jennings. Lord, my dear, how calmly you talk of it! And can Colonel wait 2 or 3 months? Lord bless me, I'm sure it would put me in I'm sure it would put me quite out of patience. And though one would be very glad to do a kindness by poor Mr. Ferris, I do not think it worth while to wait 2 or 3 months for him. Sure somebody else might have Sure somebody else might be found that would do as well. Somebody that is in orders already. My dear ma'am, said Eleanor, what can you be thinking of? Why, Colonel Brandon's only object is to be of use to Mr. Ferris. Lord bless you, my dear, Sure you do not mean to persuade me that the Colonel only marries for the sake of giving 10 guineas to Mr. Ferris. The deception could not continue after this, and an explanation immediately took place, by which both gained considerable amusement for the moment without any material loss of happiness to either, for Mrs. Jennings only exchanged one form of delight for another, and still without forfeiting her expectation of the first. And and the parsonage is but a small one, said she, after the first ebullition of surprise and satisfaction was over, and very likely may be out of repair. But to hear a man apologizing, as I thought, for a house that to my knowledge has 5 sitting rooms on the ground floor, and I think the housekeeper told me could make up 15 beds, and to you too, that has been used to live in Barton Cottage, it seems quite ridiculous. But, my dear, we must touch up the Colonel to do something to the parsonage and make it comfortable for him before Lucy goes to it. But Colonel Brandon does not seem to have any idea of the livings being enough to allow him to marry. The Colonel is a ninny, my dear, because he has 2,000 a year himself. He thinks that nobody else can marry on less. Take my word for it, if I'm alive, I shall be paying a visit at Delaford Parsonage before Michaelmas, and I'm sure I shan't go if Lucy ain't there. Eleanor was quite of her opinion as to the probability of their not waiting for anything more. That was chapter 40. Here is chapter 41. Chapter 41. Edward, having carried his thanks to Colonel Brandon, proceeded with his happiness to Lucy, and such was the excess of it by the time he reached Bartlett's Buildings that she was able to assume Mrs. Jennings, who called on her again the next day with her congratulations, that she had never seen him in such spirits before in her life. That she had never seen him in such spirits before in her life. Her own happiness and her own spirits were at least very certain, and she joined Mrs. Jennings most heartily in her expectation of their being all comfortably together in Delaford Parsonage before Michaelmas. So far was she at the same time from any backwardness to give Eleanor that credit which Edward would give her, that she spoke of her friendship for them both with the most grateful warmth, was ready to own all their obligation to her, and openly declared that no exertion for their good on Miss Dashwood's part, either present or future, would ever surprise her, for she believed her capable of doing anything in the world for those she really valued. As for Colonel Brandon, she was not only ready to worship him as a saint, but was moreover truly anxious that he should be treated as one in all worldly concerns, anxious that his tithes should be raised to the utmost, and scarcely resolved to avail herself at Delaford as far as she possibly could of his servants, his carriage, his cows, and his poultry. It was now above a week since John Dashwood had called in Berkeley Street, and as since that time no notice had been taken by no notice, and as since that and as since that time no notice had been taken by them of his wife's indisposition, beyond one verbal inquiry, Eleanor began to feel it. and as and as since that and as since that time no notice had been taken by them of his wife's indisposition, beyond one verbal inquiry, Eleanor began to feel it necessary to pay her a visit. This was an obligation, however, which not only opposed her own inclination, but which had not the assistance of any encouragement from her companions. Mary Ann, not contented with absolutely refusing to go herself, was very urgent to prevent her sister's going at all, and Mrs. Jennings, though her carriage was always at Eleanor's service, so very much disliked Mrs. John Dashwood that not even that not even her curiosity to see how she looked after the late discovery, nor her strong desire to affront her by taking Edward's part, could overcome her unwillingness to be there in her company again. The consequence was that Eleanor set out by herself to pay a visit, for which no one could really have less inclination, and to run and to risk a run-in with a woman whom neither of the others had so much reason to dislike. Mrs. Dashwood was denied, but before the carriage could turn from the house, her husband accidentally came out. He expressed great pleasure in meeting Eleanor, told her that he had just been going to call in Berkeley Street, and assuring her that Fanny would be very glad to see her, invited her to come in. They walked upstairs into the drawing room. Nobody was there. "Fanny is in her own room, I suppose," he said. "I'll go to her presently, for I'm sure she will not have the least objection in the world to seeing you. Very far from it, indeed. No, especially there cannot be. But, however, you and Miss Mary Ann were always her great favorites. Why would not Mary Ann come?" Eleanor made what excuse she could for her. "I'm not sorry to see you alone," he replied, "for I have a good deal to say to you. This living of Colonel Brandon's, can it be true? Has he really given it to Edward? I heard it yesterday by chance, and was coming to you on purpose to inquire further about it. It's perfectly true. Colonel Brandon has given the living of Delaford to Edward." "Really? Well, this is very astonishing. No relationship, no connection between them, and now that livings fetch such a price. What was the value of this?" "About 200 a year." "Very well. And for the next presentation to a living of that value, supposing the late incumbent had been old and sickly and likely to vacate it soon, he might have got, I dare say, £1,400. And now he and how came he not to have settled that matter before this person's death? Now, indeed, it would be too late to sell it. But a man of Colonel Brandon's sense, I wonder he should be so improvident in a point of such natural concern. Well, I'm convinced that there's a vast deal of inconsistency in almost every human character. I suppose, however, on recollection, that the case may probably be this. Edward is only to hold the living till the person to whom the colonel has really sold the presentation is old enough to take it. That's a fact, depend on it." Eleanor contradicted it, however. Excuse me. Where were you? Eleanor contradicted it, however, very positively, and by relating that she had herself been employed in conveying the offer from Colonel Brandon to Edward, and therefore must understand the terms on which it was given, obliged him to submit to her authority. It's truly astonishing," he cried, after hearing what you said. "What could be the colonel's motive?" "A very simple one, to be of use to Mr. Ferris." Well, whatever Colonel Brandon may say, Edward's a very lucky man. You'll not mention the matter to Fanny, however, for though I've broke it to her, and she bears it vastly well, she'll not like to hear it talked of much." Eleanor had some difficulty here to refrain from observing, and she thought Fanny might have borne with composure an acquisition of wealth to her brother, by which neither she nor her child could be possibly impoverished. Mrs. Ferris, added he, lowering his voice to a tone becoming so important a subject, lowering his voice to the tone becoming so important a subject, knows nothing about it at present, and I believe be I believe it'll be best to keep it entirely concealed from her as long as may be. When the marriage takes place, I fear she must hear of it all. But why should such precaution be used? Though it's not be to, though it's not to be supposed that Mrs. Ferris can have the smallest satisfaction in knowing that her son has money enough to live upon, for that must be quite out of the question. Yet why, upon her late behavior, is she supposed to feel at all? She's done with her son. She cast him off forever, and has made all those over whom she had any influence cast him off likewise. Surely, after doing so, she cannot be imagined liable to any impression of sorrow or joy on his account. She cannot be interested in anything that befalls him. She, sh- she would not be so weak as to throw away the comfort of a child and yet retain the anxiety of a parent. "Oh, Eleanor," said John, "your reasoning's very good, but it's founded on ignorance of human nature. When Edward's unhappy match takes place, depend upon it that his mother will feel as much as if she had never discarded him, and therefore every circumstance that may accelerate that dreadful event must be concealed from her as much as possible. Mrs. Ferris can never forget that Edward's her son." "You surprise me. I should think it was I should think it must nearly have escaped her memory by this time." You wrong her exceedingly. Mrs. Ferris is one of the most affectionate mothers in the world." Eleanor was silent. "We think now," said Mr. Dashwood after a short pause, "of Robert's marrying Miss Morton." Eleanor, smiling at the grave and decisive importance of her brother's tone, calmly replied, "The lady, I suppose, has no choice in the affair." "Choice? How do you mean?" "I only mean that I suppose, from your manner of speaking, it must be the same to Miss Morton whether she marry Edward or Robert." "Certainly there can be no difference, for Robert will now to all intents and purposes be considered as the eldest son, and as to anything else, they're both very agreeable young men. I don't know that one is superior to the other." Eleanor said no more, and John was also for a short time silent. His and John was also for a short time silent. His reflections ended thus. "Of one thing, my dear sister," kindly taking her hand and speaking in an awful whisper, "I may assure you, and I will do it, because I know it must gratify you. I have good reason to think, indeed I have it from the best authority, or I should not repeat it, for otherwise it'd be very wrong to say anything about it, but I have it from the very best authority, not that I ever precisely heard Mrs. Ferris say it herself, but her daughter did, and I have it from her, that in short, whatever objections there might be against a certain connection, you understand me, it would have been far preferable to her if it had not given her half the vexation that this does. I was exceedingly pleased to hear that Mrs. Ferris considered it in I was exceedingly pleased to hear that Mrs. Ferris considered it in that light. A very gratifying circumstance, to us all. It would have been beyond comparison, she said, the least evil of the two, and she would have been glad to compound now for nothing worse. But, however, all that is quite out of the question, not to be thought of or mentioned as to any attachment, It never could be. All that's gone by. But I thought I would just tell you of this, because I knew how much it would please you. Not that you have any reason to regret, my dear Eleanor. There's no reason of your doing exceedingly well, quite as well, or better, perhaps, all things considered. Has Brandon been with you lately?" Eleanor had heard enough, if not to gratify her vanity and raise her self-importance, to agitate her nerves and fill her mind, and she was therefore glad to be spared from the necessity of saying much in reply herself, and from the danger of hearing anything more from her brother by the entrance of Mr. Robert Ferris. After a few moments' chat, John Dashwood, recollecting that Fanny was yet uninformed of her sister's being there, quitted the room in quest of her, and Eleanor was left to improve her acquaintance with Robert, who, by the gay unconcern, the happy self-complacency of his manner while enjoying so unfair a division of his mother's love The happy self-complacency of his manner, while enjoying so unfair a division of his mother's love and liberality to the prejudice of his banished brother, earned only by his own dissipated course of life and that brother's integrity, was confirming her most unfavorable opinion of his head and heart. They had scarcely been 2 minutes by themselves before he began to speak of Edward, for he too had heard of the living and was very inquisitive on the subject. Eleanor repeated the particulars of it as she had given them to John, and their effect on Robert, though very different, was not less striking than it had been on him. He laughed most immoderately. The idea of Edward's being a clergyman and living in a small parsonage house diverted him beyond measure. And when to that was added the fanciful imagery of Edward reading prayers in a white surplice and publishing the banns of marriage between John Smith and Mary Brown, he could conceive nothing more ridiculous. Eleanor, while she waited in silence and immovable gravity the conclusion of such folly, could not restrain her eyes from being fixed on him with a look that spoke all the contempt it excited. It was a look, however, very well bestowed, for it relieved her own feelings and gave no intelligence to him. He was recalled from wit to wisdom, not by any reproof of hers, but by his own sensibility. "We may treat it as a joke," he said at last, recovering from the affected laugh which had considerably lengthened out the genuine gaiety of the moment, "but upon my soul, it's a most serious business. Poor Edward, he's ruined forever. I'm extremely sorry for it, for I know him to be a good-hearted creature, as well-meaning a fellow perhaps as any in the world. You must not judge of him, Miss Dashwood, for your slight acquaintance. Poor Edward, his manners are certainly not the happiest in nature, but we're not all born, you know, with the same powers, the same address. Poor fellow, to see him in a circle of strangers. To be sure, it was pitiable enough, but upon my soul, I believe he has as good a heart as any in the kingdom, and I declare and protest to you I was never so shocked in all my life as when it all burst forth. I could not believe it. My mother was the first person who told me of it, and I, feeling myself called on to act with resolution, immediately said to her, 'My dear madam, I don't know what you may intend to do on the occasion, but as for my part, I must say that if Edward does marry this young woman, I'll never see him again.' That's what I said immediately, and I was most uncommonly shocked indeed. Poor Edward, he has done for himself completely, shut himself out forever from all decent society. But as I directly said to my mother, I am not in the least surprised at it. From his style of education, it was always to be expected. My poor mother was half frantic." "Have you ever seen the lady?" "Oh, yes, once when I was staying at this house. I happened to drop in for 10 minutes, and I saw quite enough of her. The merest awkward country girl without style or elegance and almost without beauty. I remembered her perfectly. Just the kind of girl I should suppose likely to captivate poor Edward. I offered immediately, as soon as my mother related the affair to me, to talk to him myself and dissuade him from the match, but it was too late then. I found to do anything, for unluckily I was not in the way at first, and knew nothing of it till after the breach had taken, when it was not for me, you know, to interfere. But I had been informed of it a few hours early. But had I been informed of it a few hours earlier, I think it's most probable that something might have been hit on. I certainly should have represented it to Edward in a very strong light. 'My dear fellow,' I should have said, 'consider what you're doing. You're making a most disgraceful connection, and such a one as your family are unanimous in disapproving. I can't help thinking, in short, that means might have been found. But now it's all too late. He must be starved, you know. That's certain. Absolutely starved.'" He had just settled this point with great composure when the entrance of Mrs. John Dashwood put an end to the subject. But though she never spoke of it out of her own family, Eleanor could see its influence on her mind in the something like confusion of countenance with which she entered, and an attempt at cordiality in her behavior to herself. She even proceeded so far as to be concerned to find that Eleanor and her sister were soon to leave town, as she had hoped to see more of them, an an exertion in which her husband, who attended her into the room and hung enamored over her accents, seemed to distinguish everything that was most affectionate and graceful. All right, that was chapter 41. All right, well, I'm going to leave her there tonight. Probably pick back up tomorrow evening. But thank you very much for watching. If you're watching live or catching the replay, still with me, I hope you'll subscribe and like the video, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much for watching.